You're listening to Owning the Buy Box, an IP Secure podcast. This is the podcast for agencies, brands, and aggregators who want to master Amazon, push out unauthorized competition, and take their business to the next level. You're about to hear a conversation that'll help you maximize your growth on Amazon by owning the Buy Box. Let's get into the show.
If you're listening in today, I think you're in for a real treat on this episode of Owning the Buy Box. I'm Dave Cooper, your host. I'm also the founder and CEO of IP Secure. And today I'm really excited about this episode because we have a guest on who I think is a wealth of knowledge about, frankly, everything internet related, but a lot of the topics that we talk about on the show that touch on issues that brand owners face, that people selling on Amazon deal with. So they're sort of universally felt, and he has a lot of really great opinions. The New York Times refers to our guest as being in the heads of tech CEOs. So I'm not sure we could get a better authority on some of these topics than Mike Masnick, who is, of course, the founder and editor of Tech Dirt. Mike, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you know, on the show, we talk a lot about brand protection issues in general. And we try to kind of tie it into business elements, like how is it impacting, you know, your revenue and your customer experience and you know, not necessarily tactics as much, but I think strategically people struggle with how to deal with a lot of these issues, especially when it's on platforms that they don't control, whether that's, you know, an Amazon or a Facebook or whatever. And I was riveted by the article that you wrote recently about, you know, the court rejecting a lawsuit that was a pretty sensitive topic relative, right, to some of the products being sold there. And I want to dig into that at 2:30 and some of your thoughts around that, which are just riveting. But I know our listeners are very interested. I mean, you've been writing, I mean, you wrote like 50,000 articles, I think they said, since 1998.
Yes.
What made you start Tech Dirt? Like, how did it all get going originally?
So, you know, it's kind of funny because it's not like there was some grand plan here. You know, what really happened was that I was in business school. I was getting an MBA, and I wanted to get a job in having something to do with the internet after I graduated, and I didn't really have any relevant experience to do so. So I figured if I was writing about it and writing about the internet, that it would show a sort of passion for the internet. This is the early days. This is 96, 97.
But you were in business school. It wasn't like you were studying journalism or anything.
No, right. I was
okay.
in business school. And, you know, it was sort of, you know, mid-90s, early days of the World Wide Web and the sort of spreading of the internet and, you know, the earliest days of e-commerce. And there were lots of discussions going on about it. And I was just sort of generally interested in those things. And so I thought if I started writing about it, you know, it would really be, you know, something I could include with a resume to try and get a job.
Right.
And, you know, I sort of lucked out in some ways that I had some really, really amazing professors at business school who were, two in particular, who were incredibly forward-looking and forward-thinking about the internet and about technology and about the impact of it and how it should work and sort of the value and importance of the internet and certain types of innovation. And I really gravitated to those two professors in particular. And so then I really, you know, when I started, you know, at first I just sort of started writing about what was going on the internet, sort of with a business twist because I was getting my MBA. But I really started to view stories through the lens of what I had learned from those two professors in terms of, you know, how innovation really should work, what is the power of the internet itself. And so I just sort of had this starting framework for how to view different stories. And that's what I started writing about. And it seemed to catch on. People seemed to really like it, and it got passed around a lot. I originally started just sending it to other business school students, and they passed it on. And business schools mostly returning students, so a lot of people would come from industry, including plenty of people who'd come from Silicon Valley, and so they started sending it around, and then it started to get more and more attention. And my professors really encouraged me. They said, keep doing this writing stuff. You're really getting these ideas out there, and you're expressing it well. And so, that really made me do it. I did then graduate, and I did, successfully use it to get a job, at a startup. And I moved out to Silicon Valley, and I worked at a startup for about a year. And I got to witness the implosion of a startup from the inside, which was really kind of fascinating to see. And there are a whole bunch of stories related to that, but sort of as that startup collapsed, and I was getting more and more, not depressed, but just, unhappy at work.
Yeah.
The more
sure.
I was sort of, I was effectively wasting my time at work and writing Tech-Dirt on the side rather than doing the job, because there was nothing to be
interesting,
done, to be honest.
Yeah.
And so then, eventually I quit, just because I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't ride the crashing ship all the way down to the ground. So I quit, and I explored doing a couple other startups and talked to some folks and everything. And then somebody sat me down and said, you keep writing this Tech-Dirt thing. You really seem to enjoy it. Like, just focus on that instead. Just sort of, you idiot, like, do this thing that you love. And then that was it. From then on, it's like 25 years of continuing to build out Tech-Dirt and do whatever we could to build the business around it that would, allow me to survive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, I remember a time in the late 90s when blogging was like a real profession, right? Yes. People talked about it as if this was something you could do and make a living doing.
Yeah. I was going to say, the funny thing is that, when I started Tech-Dirt, the word blog didn't exist yet. That wasn't a thing. Yeah, that's how old I am, and that's how early it came to this. So when the word blog came along, like, I resisted it for probably 5 or 6 years. When everyone would lump Tech-Dirt in as a tech blog, which it is, right? But like, at the time, I was like, no, we're not a blog. Like, blog is like this silly little thing that people are doing. We're something different.
Right.
And that was silly. I should have just admitted it.
Right. Reality was you were sort of helping to pioneer sort of that whole user generated content space, and it's fascinating to me. I mean, I think I mentioned this to you before, but I worked at Mark Monitor for a long time in San Francisco, and we were often either associated with an article or part of one. And I actually went back and looked, and I said, what was the article? So it was 2013. Uh-oh. And we did a bunch of bad stuff that year. I mean, let's just, in fairness, I think Mark Monitor is a great company. And I think at the time, we always did things in good faith and stuff. But the reality is people made a lot of mistakes. And in particular, I think we did a couple things. One was we were trying to delist content that was like authorized HBO content. So we were basically sending DMCA notices to Google, delisting our own clients' URLs.
Right.
And you just thought that was hilarious.
Yeah. I mean, it happens more often than not, but yeah, I mean, I remember, and I agree. I mean, I think Mark Monitor was always like well-meaning and had definitely done some work, but like, as with lots of people in that space, at times, you get too aggressive, right? Or you don't look at the details.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in some ways, and it gets at some of the other stuff around like Section 230 and things like that, where it's like, it's not always easy at first glance to tell with any of this stuff, right? Where it's like, is this infringing?
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's one of those things that a lot of people think is really easy, but it's not. And that, you know, that works both ways, right? So it works on the side of like, you know, Google or YouTube, if they're hosting content, do they know if it's infringing or not? It's tough for them to tell, but it's also tough for, I mean, you know, the most famous story was Viacom, which had its, you know, decade-long lawsuit with YouTube, copyright, you know, lawsuit. At one point, they had to amend the complaint and remove the complaint had hundreds, maybe thousands of videos listed, but they had to remove 100 of them because, and this was like a year or two into the lawsuit, they realized that like somewhere around 100 of the videos were actually licensed videos that Viacom employees had uploaded themselves that then they were suing YouTube over.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, it's one of these things that I think is really important, but it was important for me to call out, you know, and I don't remember the exact context of that article, it was a decade ago, but like, it was important for me in general to call those things out, not to like just make fun of Mark Monitor, though that's fun, you know.
Right. Yeah.
But really
totally
to highlight just how difficult it is on all sides of this equation, and anyone who's making the assumption that this is obviously infringing in some way, you know, doesn't recognize the real difficulty in figuring that out.
Yeah, agreed, and insightful. I mean, I think whenever you try to do things like protect your IP at scale, it's very challenging. You know, something that I learned working at Mark Monitor for 18, 19 years is it's extremely challenging to do that at scale, do it accurately. Most people, 99% are operating in good faith. But the issue becomes, it's like, how do you do it at scale? Right. And because if all you're going to do is sort of cherry pick very small, specific scenarios to go out and defend your IP or protect a customer from something dangerous, then, you know, there's so much of it, right? You've got to do it at scale, right?
Yeah. And it's trickier than that even. I mean, I think you're exactly correct, but I think it's trickier in other ways as well, which is that, you know, protecting IP, you know, leads to, you know, what does that mean exactly? Because it can mean a whole bunch of different things, right? The problem, I think, comes in with the assumption that protecting IP always means forcing something, you know, some misuse of IP down in some way or another, right? And that's where, like, I would, you know, make fun of Mark Monitor and some other brand protection companies for, I think, going overboard. You know, there are cases where obviously that is legitimate and that is the most sensible thing to do. But there are also cases where it's like, you know, where there is a misuse that is maybe a marginal misuse, and is it worth the effort? You know, will it create backlash in some other way that creates problems? You know, are there other ways to deal with it? I mean, there are numerous cases, and I've written about some of these as well at times, where it's like somebody is using someone else's IP in some way that is, you know, most likely infringing, but like threatening them, sending some sort of legal threat or a demand letter or something like that, turns out to be the exact wrong approach. You know, it obviously depends. There's so much context involved. You know, it could be a friendlier approach, makes a lot more sense. Maybe it's something where you can approach someone and say like, hey, like we have a basic licensing setup. If you know, this use could fit within our licensing regime. Here's the best way to rectify that, as opposed to like the threatening. Or there are ones where it's just a more general friendly approach to someone saying like, you know, you might not realize that this is infringing in the way you're doing it, and we would appreciate it if you did it this way. You know, but again, like that's really difficult at scale. You know, like on a small one-to-one basis, there are ways that you can do that. But when you're doing it at scale, it's like to understand the context. It's the same thing as like the content moderation challenge that the companies face themselves on the flip side. You know, at scale, you have to set up some clear things and say like, if we see this, we do that. But that leads to situations where it's not particularly effective and actually can lead to backlash and other problems.
Yeah. It's becoming more challenging, I think, as well as these platforms have changed and, you know, become such a more sort of ingrained part of our everyday lives. I remember when we started 20 years ago, and it was like people were all bent out of shape over, eBay and Craigslist, and like their products were getting listed there. And, you'd get the occasional MySpace issue or something like that. But like Facebook wasn't even really a problem, or I should say a problem, was not a significant force right yet. And today there are platforms that touch us, 8 hours a day in one way or another, or intertwined in our psyche and in our decision making and our everyday lives. And so I feel like in some ways brand owners feel like technology and innovation is moving so rapidly, like I've got to push on the gas when it comes to trying to shield my consumer from that counterfeit or whatever it is, or some other trademark issue. That if they're not doing that, then they sort of are looked at as like not doing enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And no doubt, like in a lot of cases, and obviously this is also context dependent, there are a lot of cases where there are real risks involved if you don't monitor those things and don't take care of it. But doing it wrong also creates risks. And I feel like that side of the equation doesn't get as much attention. And that's where it leads to, over aggressive attacks and takedowns and things like that. Like, I don't know if you know, but like a couple of years ago, we got a brand protection company went after us for an article that was highlighting a satirical thing, and
that was in 2020, I think, right?
Yeah, somewhere around there, time wise, and and we were just like, look, we're writing an article about this thing, we're not selling it, and it's satire, beyond everything else, or parody.
So did they claim that the article had like their copyrighted, it's like our logo or their copyrighted material or something?
Yeah,
yes, what they could possibly claim,
It was because what it was somebody had created a satirical patch that was making fun of the North Face brand. So it had sort of like the North Face logo, but with different words. It didn't say North Face. It's something.
Right.
And the thing is, like, I think the original story was, I don't think anyone ever actually made or sold that patch. I think they just made it, or maybe photoshopped it and put a picture on a photo sharing site. And then that photo got a takedown notice, which was already problematic. So we wrote about that and shared the photo in the story. But that was like a while back. And it was like, a decade later that the brand protection agency threatened us with a lawsuit because of this like 10-year-old article that just had a picture of the patch that we had nothing to do with and hadn't sold.
Oh my God.
This is, I understand the process by which you got here, but again, it's someone, not taking the time to actually understand what the situation was and sending us a very threatening letter. And we had sort of pushed back. And in that case, the North Face reached out to us and apologized because
they just,
how bad
it's ridiculous. Yeah.
Though a few months later, we got another notice from that same brand protection.
That is just beyond almost. It's comical, Yeah. But it's also like scary because, like we did an episode of the show recently where we talked about, a lot of the lawsuits that are coming out of Chicago jurisdiction against, sellers on Amazon, and we had a reporter on who talked about it, and it was sort of very similar in that vein where there was like a lot of legit sellers that like just caught in this web because when you start doing things at scale and mass producing them, whether they're lawsuits or C&D letters or takedowns or whatever, to your point, if you're not paying attention to what's going on, then real stupid things can happen. And not only stupid things, but things that actually create liability for you as a brand.
Yes, absolutely.
Which we've seen as well.
Who is in your buy box? That's the key question, and the difference between sales growth and brand abuse and revenue loss. Monitoring your buy box is the key to brand protection success on Amazon. At IP Secure, our analytics will drive your behavior. It's not about taking down more sellers, removing more unauthorized listings. It's about knowing who's taking your revenue minute by minute and and then adjusting your response appropriately, taking action when necessary, and recapturing that revenue. Visit us today, ipsecure.com, to learn how.
So, in the article you wrote recently, this tragic story, right?
Yes.
Of suicide, using individual products, on Amazon. You wrote pretty passionately about how you felt like this legal case, inevitably went the right way in your view. And I personally think this case is a little different than the norm.
Okay.
Only because I think the individual products in and of themselves are innocuous when not combined.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Is that a true assumption on my part?
I don't know. There are claims on both sides of that, and I don't know enough about the specifics to know for sure. There were definitely people arguing that this particular is basically Amazon selling a particular chemical compound that was then used for suicide. There were claims that there's no other legitimate use of this particular chemical compound.
Understood.
Other people have claimed that there are
right, of course,
industrial uses for that particular chemical compound. But it was definitely there were these sort of some forums online that are sort of very focused on suicide and were recommending the use of this particular chemical.
Sure.
So it sort of became known more widely as if you want to end your life, this is a way to do it, which, raises a whole bunch of very, very thorny, ethical, moral questions.
Of course.
Beyond the legal questions. But certainly, that particular chemical compound was had been widely recognized as something that was used frequently for suicide. And
now, is this scenario, is this in your view, because I'd love for maybe you to help the audience understand Section 230's initial intent, at least from your perspective. And does a case like this, is this applicable in your view, and at least to the original intent of Section 230?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And this is where sort of I can give you the sort of quick overview of what Section 230
that'd be great.
is, which I think is often very misunderstood. And to me, the simplest way of understanding Section 230 is that you want to put the legal liability on the party who infused the content or whatever with its illegal properties. Whatever is violating the law, who is making it so that it is violating the law? So all that Section 230 is really doing is saying that whichever party, individual, organization infused the content in question with any violation, that's who is liable for it. So it's basically a don't shoot the messenger kind of law that properly points the liability towards the party who actually imbued the content with illegality.
And would that illegality apply to sort of anything across the board that, based on sort of U.S. code would be looked at as, some level of criminal activity?
Well, so it gets a little complicated because in most context, everything gets a little complicated. But in most contexts, Section 230 is about civil liability protection, not criminal.
Mm-hmm.
That's not entirely true, but Section 230 does exempt federal criminal liability. So anything that is, if it's U.S. code criminal law, Section 230 does not apply at all. There is no protection from Section 230 for federal criminal law. It does apply to state criminal law, which is a little bit different. And some people raise concerns about that, but it does bar state criminal claims.
Yeah.
But in almost every case, the vast majority, including this particular lawsuit, they're civil claims. So it's not the government against somebody for a criminal violation. It's some sort of tort,
Yes.
The the most common Section 231 is defamation, right? So the sort of the quintessential Section 230 issue is somebody posts something defamatory on Facebook and I sue Facebook, and the court and Section 230 basically say, no, you don't sue Facebook, you sue the person who actually posted this content.
Right.
Which is an important point, or created the content, which is an important point, because some people have argued incorrectly that Section 230 is the sort of like get out of jail free card, and it leaves no liability, and it leaves people harmed with no recourse. And that's not true, because all Section 230 is saying is sue the right party. Don't sue the platform. We recognize they may have a lot of money, and that may be a target that lawyers want to go after.
Sure.
Don't sue the platform. Sue the person who actually said the defamation, the defamatory content, or whatever else they did that violated the law. The simple act of hosting the content and allowing it to be there doesn't violate the law.
Got it. So I guess I have two kind of follow-ups on that. I mean, and the first one is, and it makes sense to me. I think the basis is, right, the platform is not the guilty party per se, right? You have to pursue the individual or entity that actually committed the act that you've been harmed by, whatever that is. What if the platform, though, is providing anonymity, which does not allow, right, a potential plaintiff to find out who they are?
Yeah, that is the big challenge, and that is one that's like the right question to ask. And there's not necessarily an easy answer to that. Now, we do have in the commerce space, there's a new law that was just passed last year that effectively is going to, and I don't know all the specifics, and I haven't looked at it lately, so don't quote me, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't. But there is a new law for marketplaces, such as Amazon in particular, that they, under this law, have to have more information about their, and have to record some information about their sellers. Know your customer kind of thing, like in the financial markets, but it does require some level of that really to deal with exactly this issue in the marketplace context. In social media context where there's like defamation, it's a little trickier, but also in some sense, I think it's okay. If we, anonymous speech is kind of an important feature under the First Amendment, and allowing people to speak is important. And in many cases, if you really need to track down someone who is actually being defamatory, there are ways to track down people. That it is a little bit more complex and takes a few steps and some effort is maybe not a bad thing to protect our anonymity. And so, there is that sort of, issue around 230 in those cases. But generally speaking, the idea that 230, because of that sort of loophole, that if you don't know who the person is who's being defamatory, that it is enabling sort of like mass defamation, doesn't really seem supported by the facts. Like, yes, there are sort of lots of cranks online and trolls who will spew nonsense, but, they're not having much of an impact in most cases. The real risk is fairly minimal.
Well, and I would think when presented with maybe a subpoena, most platforms would provide, right, any anonymized data anyway, or could be compelled to provide it.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the situation and depending on the platform. A lot of them will consider, some of them will just hand it over. There are plenty of platforms that will hand it over on receipt of a subpoena. Others will sort of, alert the user and allow them to try and quash the subpoena. In some cases, platforms will fight back if they think that it is an abusive subpoena. Pre-Elon Twitter was actually one of the most active in doing this, where they would receive questionable subpoenas all the time to try and unmask users for claims of defamation or claims of IP infringement that were really not. They were clearly just trying to unmask somebody that they didn't like. And Twitter used to go and fight those in court, which was something that I actually appreciated about the old legal.
Yeah. Well, but it's interesting, right? Because in one part of it, it's like the platform is not the decision maker, but in many ways they are the arbiter. And now they're in a situation where they have to have expertise to decipher, fake subpoenas versus real subpoenas. Yes. I mean, like it's sort of like, even though you're not necessarily responsible for whatever the final outcome is, you're all of a sudden a huge part of this process.
Yeah, and that really, that change sort of happened. I think early on, most companies would just respond to any subpoena. And companies began to realize how that process was being abused. And you said like fake subpoenas, and the incredible thing was that there are cases of legitimately, like there are some that are real subpoenas but abusively filed and for misleading purposes.
Sure.
There are also like literally faked ones. I mean, we had written a few stories over the years about questionable. They were often like frame themselves as reputation management companies who would literally fake lawsuits. They would file a fake lawsuit against a anonymous John Doe, then have someone show up, claim I am that John Doe and I am settling this case, with a settlement agreement saying I agree to take down this content. Then they would get that signed off on by the judge. They would then send that completely made up ruling to the company and say, here's a court settlement saying that they've agreed to take down this content. Now take down that content. So don't do that. That's very illegal. And
that's crazy.
Went to jail for doing that. Yeah.
That is the most insane thing. Talk about sort of Machiavellian, like this was a well thought through plan.
Yes. Yeah. And it went on for a while until somebody actually noticed it, and a couple of lawyers really tracked it down. And it's done in such a way that it's not only like devious but also pretty hidden. It would be sort of tough to discover that if you weren't really looking for it. And so that was a huge problem. But things like that caused a lot of these companies to realize like we need to look more closely. If these things are coming in and these demands are coming in, we have to be much more careful about the legitimacy of them. Not everybody, and again, like some of them are going to slip through, but
should all platforms behave and be treated the same under this umbrella of safe harbor, we'll call it, or Section 230? Because I think about platforms like Amazon, versus a Twitter, completely different places.
Yeah. I do think, right, obviously for some other laws and other issues, I think it's appropriate to treat them differently. But I think 230, it makes sense for across the board for both of them and for a whole bunch of sites. 230 is specific to the speech element, right? It's really focused on who is providing the speech and therefore who is liable for that speech. And so it creates this very clear delineation about whose speech is at issue. And so, where it gets more complicated is when you start getting to that fuzzy border of what is speech and what is conduct. And when you start talking about commerce, where does the speech part end and where does the commerce part begin? And that gets a little bit more complex. But overall, I think 230 is very well structured for handling the speech side of it.
Right, for handling the speech side of it. I think that was one of the things that I thought was interesting about this recent article, because it really wasn't about speech, right? The issue at hand was really more about commerce and the products that were being sold and who has liability for this product being available. But, I guess they can debate whether the product should be there or not. But to me, it doesn't seem sustainable to expect someone like Amazon to look at millions and millions of products and say, we know every dangerous scenario with which this product could be used. I mean, that just doesn't seem reasonable, right?
Yeah, exactly. And really, where it did come down to the speech issue in the end, which is, it's partly in sort of how this lawsuit was written to sort of try and get around some of these issues. It really was the speech at issue because it was filed as a negligence lawsuit and arguing that, Amazon was negligent in offering it up. And so, what the court looked at was, what does it take to be negligent? And in this context, it needs, the company to be misrepresenting something or like suggesting it's safe when it's not. Like that is a negligence kind of thing. But here, what the court noted was that, the speech was all pretty accurate, right? There was no underlying, there was nothing in there that said that this was safe and you should ingest it. In fact, it had warnings against it. So there was nothing misleading about it. What it came down to was the real complaint was that the plaintiffs and the lawyers in the case felt that Amazon shouldn't be selling that product at all. Right. But that's a different issue than saying, they're negligent in selling it. And so, but the underlying point is exactly true. And that's why that you made that's why Section 230 is so important when you have thousands, millions, of pieces of content or things for sale. There is no possible way that you could know all of the risks associated with anything, or whether or not something is illegal, in the social media space, whether or not something is defamatory. You can't prejudge all of that and review everything and say, this is defamatory, therefore we shouldn't allow this tweet. In the same way that you can't look over everything on Amazon and say, this product is clearly illegal or problematic or dangerous, and therefore we can't allow it ahead of time. And so, 230 says we can't hold the platform liable for allowing those things.
So now I'm going to play sort of devil's advocate against that exact point, because we know that platforms are able to do it in certain cases, right? So if Amazon can keep firearms off their platform and Facebook can keep, some other child pornography off their platform, they are proactively taking steps, I think, to keep those things off. So that might be the counterpoint that some would make is, look, if they can do it for those things, they can do it for other things.
Yep. And actually, Section 230 addresses that. And in fact, Section 230 was sort of written in particular to address that very point, which is that the case that brought about Section 230, pre-Section 230, was a situation where there was like a court case for defamation. And part of what was argued and the judge agreed to in the case was that because the website, in this case it was Prodigy, an early internet service, moderated forums and pulled down some content, because they left up some other content, therefore they had to be liable for that. And Section 230 was a direct response to that, because they said, if we say that's true, then that creates very, very bad incentives. Because what the incentives then are either take down absolutely nothing, because as soon as you start taking down anything, you become liable for the stuff that you left up. And therefore, like, the easiest way to handle that is like, okay, now we allow everything, because like we're only getting in trouble if we take down some things. So saying like, no, you won't be liable for that, allows the companies to then say, oh, wait, we want to take down, we don't want to sell firearms, or we don't want to host, CSAM content, which, is illegal. And there's a whole bunch of other issues there. But like, it allows them to do that effort and not get blamed for making a mistake. Right?
Yep.
Because then the other incentive situation that you have there is like, if you're going to get blamed for any mistake you make, you're going to go way too hard in the other direction and say, we're only going to allow things on the site after they've gone through this extensive review and careful review. And then you have a case where like, imagine Amazon had to do that, where they had to like, get a copy of every product that's being sold and test it out. Amazon is a lot smaller. It's impossible for most buyers. I'm sure that the cost to sell anything on Amazon goes way up, because you'd have to send your products to Amazon to review and test, and they might send it back and say we can't sell this or whatever. You would have a very, very different kind of internet. So 230 is this sort of like really nice middle ground that says like, yes, you can take down stuff, you can make decisions and say like, we don't want this on our platform, and you don't get liable for the stuff that you left up. And that gives you the incentive to actually look around and say like, there are certain categories of products that we don't want, certain categories of products that we're going to stop and that we're going to proactively police. But we're not going to get blamed for the stuff that we don't do that on. So I actually think Section 230 really does directly address that question.
That was a great way of explaining it. Mark Zuckerberg said you were insightful and reasonable. And I have to agree. Because that actually made complete sense to me, and I'll tell you, not a lot does. But your point was great, which is the middle ground is the right place to be, and so this enables us to take a middle of the road approach, right? You go too far in either direction, and you're no longer, you're either stifling innovation and you're crushing the internet, or you're basically creating a censorship state where everything is removed en masse, and neither one of those scenarios sounds good.
And the other thing that 230 does, honestly, that is really important is that it also allows the companies to change and to modify and experiment, because and this is something that I keep trying to get across, and is sometimes difficult for people to understand, is that like the bad actors, the real bad actors who are trying to do nefarious things in all sorts of different ways, are constantly adjusting and they're constantly changing. And if you want to fight that, as like a trust and safety team or whatever, you have to change. You have to constantly be monitoring what's going on and making changes in your own strategies as well. And 230 allows that to happen without creating or increasing liability, where if you didn't have 230, every change that you make could then get sued over, because they'll say it's unreasonable or that particular change was negligent in some way. It just creates this like opening for massive lawsuits. And so it makes it much harder for you as a platform to actually police these things. Whereas 230 says like you can experiment and change. And that also means that different platforms can experiment with different ways of handling this, and other platforms can learn from that and experiment as well. And so you get, a lot more advancement, I think, in the process of, brand safety, trust and safety, whatever you want to call it, because they can adjust and make changes over time, thanks to 230 saying that you're not going to be liable for those particular changes.
That makes a lot of sense. Like just a couple more questions, and then I'll kind of wrap it up, because I know we're a little short on time today. But disinformation, that term scares me. And it's thrown around, right? I mean, every time you put on the news, there's a disinformation task force. This gets a lot of press coming out of COVID, right? And our government's response to COVID. Are we in trouble if disinformation all of a sudden becomes, like which way is the pendulum going to swing on this thing? I worry about over censoring people's views because it's labeled as disinformation. I mean, what are your thoughts on that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky problem, right? I mean, there is, objectively, there are things that are false information that is being spread, and in some cases that can be, dangerous or increase risk. And that's something to be concerned about. But the question then is like, what do you do about it, and how do you deal with it? And, how do you avoid the sort of overcorrection in the other direction as well? I generally don't really like the term disinformation, because it is really, really weighted, and it's also very easy to weaponize. And there are a couple of things, like I remember in the lead up, just as an example, let me say something else actually. There was actually a really great article by this reporter, Joe Bernstein, that looked into disinformation and like research on disinformation and misinformation, that I think is just great for anyone who's thinking about this subject, because it kind of highlights that, the platforms that are most blamed for disinformation, such as Facebook, have, a weird, somewhat twisted incentive to play up that narrative, because it's effectively saying the content on our platform is so powerful, it can change minds and cause people to believe things, which is a great thing when they're talking to their advertisers and they want to sell them on advertising on Facebook. Wow,
that's a fascinating perspective that most people are not thinking about. Yeah, exactly.
And Joe went through the research and said, there's very little proof that disinformation is as powerful as people believe it to be. That's not to say that there aren't false stories that make the rounds, sure, and there aren't people who fall into deep rabbit holes of complete nonsense in often dangerous ways. That is obviously true. That is obviously in existence. But there are very, very large questions about who it impacts and how widely and what the larger aspect of it is. And so, I think where we are right now is the world is sort of learning how to live in a space where everybody can communicate with everybody, because we've never had that before. We've had historically local communications, and then you would have slightly more distance communications, but very limited, very gatekeepered in terms of who could actually make use of the more broadcast speech. Then we began to have like point-to-point communications where you could have telephone, across larger and larger distances. But this is over the last 20, 25, 30 years, this is the first time we've ever had a time when everybody can speak to everybody, right?
Yeah.
And we as a society don't have the tools or the training or the mental capacity, frankly, to deal with that shift in the world. And I would like to believe that as society itself evolves, we will begin to learn how to deal with that reality. There are always going to be people who are pushing nonsense, and there are always going to be people who tell false stories and do so for a variety of reasons, whether it is that they truly believe it, or whether it is they're trying to profit from it, whether it is they're, who knows, right? There are all sorts of reasons for that. We're still reaching the stage where we figure out how we deal with that on a global scale. Again, like so much of this discussion really comes back to scale. Like, wow, scale's a real problem in all sorts of contexts, and, but it is something that society has to deal with. But I think the focus on disinformation as the problem itself is misguided. And it's really a symptom of like the world figuring out how everybody can talk to everybody. And so
I think that's fascinating. I mean, I really do. I think most people think about, that issue of disinformation and feel like it's a nothing burger. They to sort of echo, I think, the sentiment of the article that you referenced, like, we don't really know, like, people really fall for this? Like, does this really matter? Like, how much does it really matter?
Right.
And I think you're right. I kind of feel like in many ways the media intensifies the message, which then makes it feel much more important and impactful than it really is. But the reality is billions of people a day sharing information online, billions of times every minute, and doing it fine, right? Successfully, and without negative consequences. It's super interesting to me. And so do you think, last question, and then I promise I'll let you go, 230, keep it as is? Do you think, is Congress going to mess this thing up because they're going to, poke around, or they're going to take a few pieces of legislation and all of a sudden decide they have a better way of doing this? So should it stay the same? And even if we want it to, will they screw it up anyway?
I mean, the answer to both questions is probably yes, right? So it's 230, I think, honestly, despite all the criticism that it gets, I think has been one of the most effective, useful, powerful, successful laws that Congress has passed in the last 30 years. If you understand it, and most people don't, if you understand it and understand the context in which it has played out and look at the lawsuits in which it has been a part of, it has been a phenomenal tool in enabling the internet that we have today, enabling all of the things that we like about the internet today. There are some concerns about that it has also enabled some of the things that we dislike about the internet today, but it's very difficult to figure out a way to get rid of those without undermining all of the good stuff that the internet has brought. That doesn't mean that Congress isn't going to try. They're absolutely trying. They've been trying for a couple of years. I am completely open. I have an open mind that somebody could present to me a better solution than 230. I have not seen it. Everything that I've seen, I think, creates massive problems, often because they don't understand the interplay of all of these things and has sort of how 230 really works. And they have a very, very confused interpretation of what they think 230 is and what they think removing it or changing it would do. And what they don't realize is that mostly what they are doing would be enabling a ridiculous number of very, very questionable lawsuits that just lead to companies really backing off, allowing certain things that most people find really useful and services that people actually love that would really be limited by most of the proposed changes to 230.
Well said. Mike, this has been great. I really appreciate you spending all this time with us. I think Zuckerberg's right. I think you're insightful and thoughtful. Anyone who's not going to Tech Dirt and reading, your insightful pieces, I think is definitely missing something. If they care about these issues, and especially if they make their living in technology, quite honestly, it's a must read. So I really appreciate you spending the time. And again, anyone can follow us on iTunes, on Google, anywhere you get your major podcasts. We're owning the Buy Box, and this has been Mike Masnick, the founder of Tech Dirt. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a really fun discussion.
Awesome. Take care, Mike.
Cool.
You've been listening to Owning the Buy Box, a show from IP Secure. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. Please give us a rating, leave a comment, and share episodes that you love. That helps us keep delivering you the tools you need to sharpen your competitive edge and ensure your authorized sellers always own the Buy Box. We'll see you next time.